Welcome, everyone, to the SSRC NEH SHIP Grant Informational Webinar. I'm joined by my colleague, Bree, who will be helping out today. My name is Jason Rohde. I am a program director at the Social Science Research Council, which is an independent international nonprofit organization that was founded in 1923. We're located in Brooklyn, New York, but we have an international reach. And we foster innovative research, nurture new generations of scholars, and try to deepen inquiry and how it is practiced across the humanities and social science disciplines. We're nonpartisan, non-advocacy, 501c3, and we mobilize necessary knowledge on important public issues, recognizing that humanities and social science research brings unique insights that help us learn from history, understand the present, and plan for the future. And we're really thrilled to reignite our relationship with the National Endowment for the Humanities through this grant program. Previously, we partnered with NEH on a major regranting program in the 1980s and 90s through the International Postdoctoral Grants Program and International Research Program. But we want to keep our time together focused and leave time for your questions. So I'll just invite you to explore our other grant opportunities and resources at ssrc.org. So today, we're here to talk about Sustaining Humanities Infrastructure Program and its application process. The application guidelines are at the link that you see on your page. We'll have this slide up at the end of the presentation as well. I do encourage you, if you have any questions at any time in the process of working on your proposal or thinking through whether or not to submit a proposal, to email us at nehrescue@ssrc.org. We're happy to engage with you on any questions that you might have and help you think through fit with the program and things along those lines. But hopefully what we'll cover today will help you think those issues through. So what is the Sustaining Humanities Infrastructure Program, or SHIP? We're awarding funds to humanities organizations who are really seeking relief and planning for recovery in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's quite a wide spectrum. I just want to emphasize that. Now, awards are really intended to support people, projects, and resources at the core of humanities teaching and scholarship. That's what we're thinking about in terms of infrastructure: people, projects, and resources, and institutions. We strongly encourage projects that emphasize topics and themes and approaches related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're really also encouraging applications from minority serving institutions. The program is funded through the National Endowment for the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan, which is a law passed by Congress to bring relief. There are other programs like ours. I believe NEH funded 7 organizational regranting programs and several other fellowship regranting programs. And so you should also, I encourage you to explore the full range of programs on offer. We can share a link with you later, the list of those programs. But ours is really intended to support this broad infrastructure that can be considered in people, projects, and resources. So what kind of projects might those be? So one is just support for staffing, including students or research assistants, staff across the institution, at humanities centers, for example, or elsewhere in departments whose activities were under or are under threat due to funding restrictions related to the pandemic. So if you have graduate students who are doing research assistance with you, and the research has been delayed because of the pandemic, and the salary you need to continue so that you can finish that research, that's a perfectly eligible application to put forward. If you have staff at your humanities center or your digital humanities center who, again, we're working on projects, and you need to support those staff with funding for, then you can absolutely ask for those. You could do a combination of funding requests for staff as alongside funding requests to support other elements of projects or programs. One element that we're really keen to see applications for is the second bullet, which encourages departmental, college, or university level efforts to examine and produce concrete steps, which can include revised tenure and promotion guidelines and timelines, or other kind of staffing promotion guidelines to address the disproportionate impact the pandemic has had on humanities scholars, particularly women, people of color, caregivers, and other vulnerable populations. We're very aware of the fact that timelines have shifted. There's a lot of literature out there on the impact on humanities scholars and social scientists in doing their work during the course of the pandemic, and the increased caregiving responsibilities that drew them away. These like the pandemic itself, the effects of this impact were not equally distributed, but did hit particular vulnerable populations. So we encourage you to think through with your department, your college, your unit, ways to address this question. You can also ask for funds to sustain critical humanities projects or digital humanities projects that are used widely by researchers or teachers, and particularly if these projects address inequality or reach underserved populations. But during the course of the pandemic, many resources were either created or enhanced or further developed in order to support online teaching and research. And so if you have a project like that, that also falls within this sort of recovery mandate within the ARP program. I do see some questions are starting to come in, and we'll get through a few more slides, and then I'm going to start to address those in turn. But please go ahead and start to populate questions with others so that we can make sure to get through as many as possible. Okay, so other things that can be supported. You can strengthen your college university instruction by preserving or refining or developing online or hybrid humanities curricula. We're really seeing this as a resilience building project in humanities education. Once again, as with projects and research projects that I just described earlier, a lot of educational materials were developed in the course of the pandemic, and a lot of universities are still in hybrid, remote, or some version of instruction, or using those resources in live classrooms. And so you can certainly apply to sustain those materials, pay for the staffing to do so, and so on. There are essential services, programming that sustain the next generation of humanities scholars, such as humanities PhDs. And these have been affected in the wake of the pandemic. So you can provide essential services to these students to help them address the impact that COVID had on their work in the wake of the pandemic. And we also, again, encourage you to think about these things through the lens of strengthening diversity, equity, and inclusion. And finally, funding to rebuild live or virtual programming to regain or expand access to humanities content for public audiences. Now, the pandemic affected us in a variety of ways. And one of the things that even here at SSRC we noticed is that our audiences didn't necessarily decline, but they absolutely shifted in who we were reaching with some of our public events, because as things moved on, we were able to engage a broader reach, different audiences and so forth. But I know a lot of humanities institutions are really rethinking their public programming, and this is an opportunity for you to receive funding to do that work. These are just some suggestions. Really, the primary emphasis, of course, of any project that you might suggest is that it must focus on the humanities, and in some ways must be framed by this question of relief or recovery related to COVID. So these are some suggestions, but they're not an exhaustive list of suggestions. So please reach out if you're not sure if your project may fit, and we'll be happy to talk with you about it. All right, in terms of eligibility, and I see a couple eligibility questions starting to come into the chat as well. One, you must be a US-based humanities organization seeking relief. Again, planning recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. These can include accredited 501c3 institutions, which include learned societies oftentimes, US nonprofit organizations with 501c3 status. So any sort of higher ed, university, college, nonprofit that has some mission related to humanities work is eligible under this program. Foreign or non-US organizations and for-profit entities are not eligible, although that does not prohibit a US-based organization working with external partners that may be not US-based. The applicant should be able to demonstrate a record of achievement of some sort in the humanities, which is to say that you've worked in the humanities in the past. and continue to do so in the future. And again, just emphasizing that priority in this program will be given to projects and institutions that emphasize diversity, equity, inclusion, and minority serving institutions. We've covered that SHIP does not support foreign and for-profit entities. And as you may have surmised from the last slide, that activities and projects outside of the humanities do not count. Now, oftentimes we receive questions, what are the humanities? This is a question I know NEH also receives a lot, and often the definition of the humanities they point to is in their founding legislation, which really is a list of different disciplines, ranging from history, language, foreign languages, even legal studies and so forth. So we have a very broad idea of what the humanities can be, but it's up to you in the proposal to make the case. Now, here's a tricky one about what we can and can't support. Organizations that have received 2021 American Rescue Plan funds directly from the NEH, there was a May competition specifically for this, are not typically eligible to receive further funds under these regranting programs. However, certain large institutions, for example, will have multiple areas of study, multiple centers under its umbrella. So there may be, say, a university press and a humanities center that have what's known very technically as, that have different DUNS numbers that identify sort of an entity within the university as a different entity. If your DUNS number is different, then you may be eligible. So I would encourage you, if you have a question along these lines, to please reach out. Now, if you received funding under the CARES Act in 2020, that does not apply here. And it does not apply if you've received other kinds of NEH funding or federal funding. What the key is that you need to make sure that you're not what NEH often refers to as double dipping, which is to say you're not trying to fund the same thing twice with different pools of money that flows from the government. Also not supported under this program are the 56 state and jurisdictional humanities councils. There's a whole nother set of programs that are meant to support the councils. Just some quick basics on the grants. We anticipate approximately 20. Now, everybody knows this can vary based on how many applicants, how much is requested, because the sum is up to $100,000. So some people may ask for less, and that's perfectly okay. But we're anticipating around 20 grants. Projects themselves may begin as early as April 1st, 2022, but have to start no later than June 1st, 2022. And they must conclude by May 31st, 2023, over the course of a 12-month time period. And that's based on NEH requirements for this program that limits 12 months, and all funds must be spent down by May 31st, 2023. So the application requirements. We have an online application system here at SSRC. You can find it very easily at apply.ssrc.org. And it's also linked to from the guidelines, which we'll put the link in the chat once again. The application requirements. So there's an application form itself that requires things like institutional information. These are, just to make very clear, institutional awards, not individual awards. That means that you have to provide a DUNS number, which many of you should have if you've ever applied for federal awards in the past. If you do not have a DUNS number, please reach out. We can help you find a pathway to getting one, but you should make sure you do so in advance of the deadline, because it can take some time to get. The application form will also ask you for contact information, both for the principal investigator or project director, as well as the institutional, the person who would be directly responsible for managing the grant institutionally, handling the money and so forth, and a project abstract. In supporting documents for this application, we are asking for a description of the project of no more than 5 single-space pages, that and then a budget and budget narrative. We don't have a strict budget template, but if you have questions about how you should outline your budget, please reach out. We ask for brief CVs, and by which we mean usually 2-page CVs for key project participants. And finally, a letter of institutional support that should come from an appropriate level of authority overseeing the project, which is to say, if it's a departmental grant, maybe either the department head or the dean, and so forth. Okay. So what's in the, just to get into a little bit more detail about what's in the project description, it will ask you for your primary goals in applying for the grant. So why are you applying, and what the relevance of that project is to the vitality and flourishing of the humanities. In other words, what's the relevance to the humanities specifically? And then we ask you to detail what impact did COVID-19 have on your operation, on your center, on your department, on your project, and ways that this award would help mitigate that impact. So you can talk about maybe where non-tenure track faculty lost certain kinds of support, and therefore you are hoping to replace some of that support in the wake of the pandemic, or graduate students, or so forth. So if your activity does address diversity, equity, inclusion, please be explicit about this component, about how it does address this component of the application. And then you'll identify numbers of staff who will be engaged in the work, audience of the program or activities that you plan to implement, plan to use the grant to expand your reach to new audiences if that's part of your overall plan, or ways that you plan to engage constituents on your campus. And then, of course, the normal things that you would expect from a grant. What's the timeline and work plan included in this work? And what are your expected outcomes? What results do you anticipate coming from these grants? And that can be both in terms of outputs, right? In terms of like if you are plan to write a report or share or have a certain number of events, but it can also be about people and processes, right? How are you impacting the people at your organization? What effect will this have on their work? We're not looking explicitly for a kind of just outputs orientation. Okay, so what evaluation criteria do we have for this program? Intellectual merit. This includes alignment to the humanities and your justification for the activities that you described. The alignment to the COVID-19 response itself. How does this relate to COVID-19? Is it directly tied? Is it loosely tied, etc.? The feasibility, excuse me, the feasibility of the project activities that you describe, and the kind of work plan and timeline and budget. Do these all work in a way that move these activities forward? And finally, the qualifications of the applicants and the people involved. I should speak for a moment to our review process. We'll be bringing in reviewers very much in SSRC's tradition. From all over the country, a diverse collection of humanities scholars and including faculty, staff, librarians, and so forth, to review these applications. They'll rank them, come together to discuss them, and then we'll select a sort of a list from those discussions and rankings at the end of that process. So the deadline is December 7th, 2021. So please mark that on your calendars. We again encourage you to reach out to us at NEH Rescue at SSRC with questions if they're not answered for you today. I'm checking the time, so we're making good time, I think. And so we're going to dive into the questions that we have. And I think, Bree, you're going to share some with me, right?
Absolutely. So we have a couple questions that have come in. Someone asks, is COVID-related reduction of enrollment impact on budget resulting in program cuts a suitable justification?
That's a great question. I think that absolutely great. It's a justification for a set of activities in order to respond to to those enrollment declines. And so I think what you'll want to do is then make the case about how the funding can help you address or mitigate or respond to those factors. And I could imagine it could take a number of approaches. One, it could help sustain staff who might otherwise be impacted in terms of their jobs and livelihoods. You could also use funding to take concrete steps to rethink how to bolster enrollment numbers in the wake of the pandemic in order to respond to the departmental needs. So there's a range of activities that I think that you might be able to explore there, but the key is that's a reasonable justification, but then you need to tie it to an effective plan of action moving forward.
Thanks, Jason. Another attendee asks, they ask if they can assume that learned societies that fit these parameters can apply.
Yes, absolutely. Scholarly societies, learned societies, other kinds of US-based 501c3 nonprofits that are dedicated to the humanities in various capacities are all eligible to apply under this program.
Our next question is, if we are applying to another relief grant that's been funded by the NEH ARP program, can we apply to both from one university campus for different projects? Thanks.
That's a great question. Absolutely, you can apply to more than one of the different programs that are available to this. What I would say is don't apply for the same project to two different organizations, but if they are separate projects, then absolutely you can apply. We don't put any restrictions on, because you never know which one may fare better in peer review, which project may have greater chances of success. So we're not going to discourage any applications to any of the programs.
We were asked how many applicants we anticipate.
That is a great question. As someone who has been in this role as funder for many years, that is the hardest question to answer in the very first iteration of any program. And this is where we're at. It's very hard to guess how many applications we can anticipate receiving, because it's just, it would only be a guess based on inquiries and outreach at this point. And so it's hard to know. What we do know is how many awards we plan to make, which again is probably around 20. But I will go back to something I've said in, I think, every single grant workshop I've ever offered, is always apply if you have an idea that fits the criteria and that is suitable, because the only application that will not be funded guaranteed is the one that's never submitted. So I will say also, we worked really hard. We understand that everybody's been under a tremendous amount of pressure due to the pandemic, the lasting results of the pandemic. And so we tried really hard not to make the application onerous in any way. We tried to keep it flexible and fairly easy to respond to, with basically a 5-page single-space proposal or less, and some additional information. So hopefully the burden won't be too great. Okay.
Our next question is, someone asks, can proposals include multiple programs if they all fit into the categories that the grant program is looking to fund?
Can proposals include multiple programs if they, so I'm
fit into the categories.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You're not restricted to, just as a couple of examples, if we're talking about the categories of like the 6 or so bullets that I shared, if they address 3 of those bullets, then that's fantastic. That's great, and if they address 1, that's also great. That's absolutely fine. Likewise, if you are talking about programs that are across the campus, it's absolutely fine to coordinate and collaborate with your colleagues on campus and to bring them together for a single application. I would emphasize, finding an appropriate through line so that you can show the sort of integrity of the sort of justification, I should say, of that joining. But it's absolutely appropriate to work across campus with your colleagues, particularly at this moment in time. So we encourage you to think creatively about these issues, and I hope that I think that answer hopefully gets to both sides of your question.
Our next question is, if a project was started with Title VI funding and we plan to write that project into our upcoming Title VI proposals, are we ineligible for the SHIP grant?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think that would restrict you. I mean, any sort of funding that has supported the project, the key is making the case for this slice of the work that you plan to do. And so, I would just like any other kinds of outside funding or, federal, non-federal funding that may be supporting a longer term, broader project, this can stand alone within that broader framework and it does not render your application in any way ineligible.
Our next question, is there any matching funds requirement, or will matching funds make the application more competitive?
That's a really good question. So one, no, you are not required to have any matching funds whatsoever in your proposal. And the question about whether or not matching funds make your proposal more competitive, I know that a lot of organizations have started to move away from matching funds because it can create sort of disproportionate senses of investment from different institutions, which can also increase a kind of bias. Institutions that have matching funds available, or more readily, or therefore can make themselves seem more competitive in competition. So we do not discuss matching funds at all in the review requirements. In terms of having to have them or emphasizing that anybody should have them. I typically discourage people from counting any kind of matching funds as a qualifying or disqualifying factor related to other elements of the proposal. So if you have them, I think you can include them in your budget. We don't have a restriction against that. But it's not meant to be a factor, because it can sometimes mean that in some institutions who just don't have matching funds at this time would otherwise be just, less competitive, and that's not something we want to do.
The next question that someone asks is, the proposal notes that it will fund staff positions. Would postdoctoral positions also fit within the criteria?
Absolutely. Excuse me. The pandemic has hit everybody from at all levels across the humanities, and postdocs are certainly already in vulnerable positions in many ways. The job market in the humanities, we're all quite aware, has also been impacted by the pandemic. And so absolutely, you can apply to sustain graduate students, postdocs, junior faculty, non-tenure track faculty, staff, and so on. There's no restrictions whatsoever. You just have to make the case for the work that you want to do and who you're trying to support, but there's no restrictions whatsoever. So let's see. I think we have one
more so far. If you have any more questions, please send them in using the Q&A function. Someone asks, if the recipient is US based, can the scope of the project be international, i.e. benefit indirectly non-US humanities organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will once again rely on on old language that I picked up at NEH, which is that the humanities know no bounds. In other words, the humanities expand across borders. So the eligibility requirement is that the applicant be a US based organization. Now, there is one instance in which in the requirements from NEH that were given to us. So if there is a US based organization that is located abroad, then the funding still must be used to support staffing or individuals who I believe are US citizens. If you look in our FAQ, and this is a good time to plug our frequently asked questions, at the URL for the proposal guidelines, you'll see an FAQ in the right-hand side, and it can get into more detail, or you can email me. But if, for example, your scope of project involves discussions that are not just located in the United States, that's fine, because the humanities are not obviously located just in the United States. But that's a great question, and thanks for bringing it up. I do see a question that's like, what are good tips as we prepare our application? So I would say it's just some quick tips, and again, happy to discuss these further with you if you have questions. Is one, go ahead and create an account at apply.ssrc.org. That's our application portal. That will give you a chance to look through the application form, and you'll be able to know that you need to gather someone probably in your Office of Sponsored Researchers name. And I encourage you to reach out to your Office of Sponsored Research. So they'll be probably your institutional contact, for example, that you would put into the form. You'll be able to know what other elements that you need to be able to fill out there. I would encourage you to please read the guidelines, and then go ahead and, I always say, read the guidelines twice. They really are meant to try to help you think through the process of applying. But following that, please reach out with questions. We really want to make sure that as many people who are eligible to apply can apply, because this has been a long moment of crisis, and we want to be supportive of you, your projects, and your institutions. And finally, prepare early by gathering necessary materials like your DUNS number, which your institution should have, and so on. And that will get you a long way into starting to think through how to apply and get prepared for this opportunity. Let's see.
We have another question. Someone asks, could funds be used to pay contributors? Example, if collecting resources, could those who contribute resources be paid for contributing their work?
Yeah. The only restriction on, so yes, you could absolutely pay people for their contributions to your project, and I strongly advocate paying for labor. I know this is an ongoing conversation across many disciplines and in many contexts, but so absolutely you should do so. The one thing that there is a restriction on is travel. And I think that the justification, this was passed down through, and it applies broadly to all ARP NEH grants, including the ones that they themselves offered earlier in the year. And I think the sort of justification around that is in the wake of the pandemic, during the course of the pandemic, I should say, since we're not quite in the wake of it yet, we should not be using funds to pay people's travel costs to go to places. But you can also, say you have a workshop that was canceled due to the pandemic and you would like to run that workshop, you can certainly pay for the staffing involved in preparing that workshop. You can pay for other elements around that workshop if you anticipate it being a hybrid or in-person event, but you just simply cannot pay for travel. But the other, but you should certainly pay for people and their labor.
We were asked if you would offer the reading of drafts of proposals in advance.
It's a great question. And I know NEH and many other programs do offer full reads and feedback. I don't think that we can offer that at this time. However, we would be very happy to sit down and just chat with you about your project, If you have questions, we can answer them. If you have a specific request or question about a section of the proposal that you're working on, if you have a budget question, if you are uncertain about framing or appropriate fit, all those sorts of things, we do encourage you to reach out, but we're not going to do a full, we're unable to do full draft reads at this time.
We have another question. Is working with a vendor an allowable cost for a service that will help with a project?
Yeah, absolutely. You can do, you can pay for vendors as, again, there's eligible or allowed activities, and then there's the sort of review process. So it's certainly, you're certainly allowed to pay for vendors, pay subcontractors. But one thing that you cannot, and then the process of review is that feasibility aspect of the project, which is where reviewers will examine, what you plan to do, what vendors you plan to use, what activities, what outcomes, all that sort of stuff, and they put together their idea of like what, their perspective of how viable and significant the project is. So, but yes, absolutely. One thing I should mention as we're talking about allowable things, one thing that you cannot apply to do, and this is again an explicit restriction from the NEH, is run another program, a competitive program to re-grant funds, because essentially NEH already did that, and then there's several of us who are now re-granting funds from that. And so, for example, a department could apply to fund some of their graduate students in order to support them. What they can't do is apply to receive money in order to run a competitive process where people would apply, graduate students would apply to receive that funds, if that makes sense. It's too many nesting dolls of re-granting. And so that's something that NEH would not allow. Okay. What else?
We have another question. Would payment of stipends for an advisory board be allowed as payment for contribution to this project?
That's a great question. Again, I think that yes, you can absolutely pay for people who are advisory board members. What I would encourage you to do is make sure that you're keeping in mind the recovery aspect and of this grant program and the COVID aspect of this program. So just if you're paying them, I would take time either in the budget justification or in the proposal proper, just to walk through why you're compensating and how it adds to the broader plan of the proposal. But I myself am a firm believer that, again, we need to increasingly and reasonably pay people for their labor.
An attendee asks, we have 2 active NEH grants. Will this count against us if we decide to apply to SHIP? So it's eligibility related. Absolutely
not count against you at all. I think that the one restriction, as I mentioned before, is if your institution received ARP funding through NEH's own competition. I believe it was back in, the deadline was like May 13th, back earlier this year. Then there's a little bit of complication because you should not apply with the same DUNS number. If the institution has different DUNS numbers and it's a different set of activities, different units, etc., then it can be considered, but it should not be duplicative of the previous ARP funding that's been received, if that makes sense. But otherwise, but say you applied to the Division of Public Programs and you have a digital project for the public grant, that does not prevent you from being able to apply for these funds. In fact, you may say, hey, we've been working on this NEH grant and we were directly impacted by the pandemic, and so we are we need to pay the staff more in order to continue the project on. Then you can absolutely do that.
Someone has a regranting question, and they ask, do you mean that we can't ask for proposals from grad students at our own institutions in order to select whom to give the funding within our own programs?
So what I mean is that you cannot ask, this is where we're getting into very complex nuance. So I will just say that you cannot run a full regranting program in order to award grants to your students in a competitive process. I know there's a kind of like a pretty strong undercurrent of nuance there, and that's intentional. I mean, I believe that you can have a selection process. So maybe it's a students, an opportunity for students to make known that they are in need of support. I think that would be slightly different, but that's not a competitive regranting process. I hope that is somewhat clearer. And we can point again to the FAQ. If you email me, what I'll do is I'll find the very specific language from NEH about this, so that we can make sure that you have a very precise answer to help you guide your plan for your project. See one more question pop up.
So an attendee asks, they say that they are the ED of a small nonprofit. Can they write their own institutional letter of support?
Yes, you can, or if you one good way, in case you're concerned about that, is to ask someone on your board of directors to submit a letter instead. So those are a couple of different options for you to consider. All right. I think we promised about 40 minutes in terms of time. So I think we've nearly hit the mark. We've stretched just over, but I don't see any further questions. So I do encourage you to reach out to us if you have further questions. We're really excited about this program. We're really grateful to the NEH for supporting this program. And I'm also grateful to my colleague Bree for her work on this program. So thank you everybody for joining us. If you have questions, reach out, and we look forward to seeing your proposals. Take care now.